Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
Well, hello, sir.
Good morning, Dr. Blackwell. Wonderful to see you again.
Same here, Peter. It's always an honor and a pleasure to interact with you. I literally mean that.
Thank you. This will be interesting. We're in a much less formal situation, and I have no idea what Dr. Nelson is going to do to us today.
Yeah, I've had nightmares, but we made it.
Well, that'll be two of us having nightmares, and it'll be fun. No matter what, it'll be fun. Michael, your background and bio doesn't nearly scratch the surface of your accomplishments, but I appreciate you sharing it.
Well, thank you. I've been blessed, is the way I see it. Very fortunate. Many of us go down a path with multiple, I call it multiple careers, and never planned 1 second of it.
Oh, been there. I listen. There's no way when I was in veterinary school that I thought I would be doing what I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
I'm very glad. I'm sorry that I'm not as actively involved, but I'm very glad that the Aligned Care situation in LA has taken off.
It has, and there's going to be some lessons to learn. But there's every reason to believe that will go on to achieve great things. It's going to have to grow organically, which is good, but we're excited.
So, Michael, we started out with conversation on access to care. And with that, we got into the discussion of systems or lack of systems or siloed systems. I would actually go with siloed systems because I think within each silo, there are systems, but systems in an optimal situation interact with each other, and one helps or hinders depending upon how a system works with one another.
Yeah. So
I think we've done a very good job of addressing a large number of issues that ultimately, in my assessment of things, indicate that we need to start to tear down some of these silos and start to integrate and cross-pollinate, for lack of a better way to put it, the different systems in a more effective and efficient fashion, whether it's the education system, whether it's the practice model system, whether it is the access to care system, whether it is the association system. So I think we've done a great job of identifying the fact that there is a need for better cross-communication and sharing of ideas to find ways to set the course for the future.
Yeah.
I want to kind of bring that thought to a close because I really want to talk to you about some other things.
Okay. Let's have at it.
You're a second generation veterinarian. And for those of you who have never met Michael Blackwell, Michael's also Black. So you're a second generation in a profession that we know is overrepresented with people that look like me. I would love to hear your story, and but more importantly, I'd love to hear your dad's story in terms of how he became interested in becoming a veterinarian. And I'm sure you grew up in a cage in the hospital.
I did. Well put. I had a flashback there for a moment. Thank you for the question, Peter. I start out talking about my story by saying I'm actually among the privileged in society. Even as a minority, I have the privilege to be able to say that I'm privileged. And why is that? Because I was born to parents who were educated. My dad's early days in practice were Jim Crow segregation. And he worked 7 days a week, helping to ensure the economic viability of those families in Southeast Oklahoma. Most owned livestock, it was rural America back in the day. Their well-being was dependent upon him as a veterinarian. What I saw modeled in front of me every day was the respect he was paid. Now, in the early years, I didn't have any sense of race problems. Think about this. Most of his clients were white. He was getting up every day serving them. We were solidly middle class on those white dollars. So the world I grew up in, turns out, was a little different from the one I came to appreciate did exist. My dad was appointed by the governor of Oklahoma to be on the Civil Rights Commission. And so he was quietly doing his part to get things addressed, including asking me to integrate the white high school going into the 9th grade. That was a shocker. I wasn't expecting that one, but I trusted my dad, and he explained why. I understood the Supreme Court decision had been made 10 years prior, and Oklahoma was now trying to experiment, if you would, offer choice. And his first thing he said to me was, "You're saying you want to be a veterinarian. That means you want to be in veterinary practice, have a veterinary practice. That means you want to be in business. You need to start now learning how to work with white people." That was the way it was put. The whole idea of familiarity breeds trust in a sense, and just certainly understanding. So I ended up going and making that transition. And it was more traumatic than I thought. It took years to know why. There was not a lot of violence or anything. It was just being ripped out of your own community, because the other 3 students were from a country school way out. I didn't even know them. I was from the main Black school in Southeast Oklahoma, but the only one. And Peter, at that point, I was really isolated because I wasn't overwhelmingly welcomed by white people. And I was being discarded by the Black community as not wanting to be with them anymore. Now, mind you, this little teenager didn't even make that decision. You think you're better than us, you'd rather be with the white people. I heard those kind of comments. And so I had to weather that sort of thing and basically bury it. But I think the main thing that I took out of those early years is this. I happen to be a Black man who didn't grow up seeing limitations. I know there's a system. There's systemic racism in the country. I mean, through the 8th grade, many of my books were hand-me-downs from the white school. A lot of our supplies were. So while understanding that, I never, fortunately, got convinced that I couldn't succeed. Somehow those two didn't line up. And so I've always had an attitude that pretty much do whatever I choose to do. Again, recognizing there are real limitations out there. And during my career, I did pass brothers along the way, mostly brothers, who I thought were their own worst enemy, because they had been so molded by some previous early year experiences that in some cases, everything looked like racist intent was involved. When somebody said something or did something. Many times it wasn't. It was just that was the perspective, Dean, that the person had on the world. My heart bled for those folks because I saw literally what I consider people being handicapped. Now, this goes back to slavery. When slavery ended, and by the way, I'm going to be speaking at a meeting with Dean on Juneteenth. And it's meaningful to me because my great-grandfather was born a slave in Texas, and that was where Juneteenth got its name, Texas slaves being the last one to hear about the end of slavery. At any rate, my great-grandfather born a slave. My grandfather had a large working farm. I don't even know all the historic details about how that came to be. And then his son, my father, became a veterinarian. At the time, we only had about 80 in the country. He went to Prairie View College, which is a HBCU in Texas, to study dairy science. Well, why is that? Because he grew up on a farm where there were dairy cattle. My grandmother made butter and sold buttermilk. My dad was going to study dairy science. It was at that time that the idea to establish Tuskegee came up, and a couple of his faculty at Prairie View were asked to join that new vet school. Why did we need a new vet school? Because we couldn't get in the majority schools. In fact, when I graduated in 75, we had 18 veterinary colleges, and most at that time still had not admitted a person of color. And I know that because as student chapter president, we had a lot of discussions about trying to take that on and challenge these colleges. We were just too busy as best students. It never did mature. But so that's how he ended up going to Tuskegee. He advised or mentored by an instructor and went there. So that's the short version, believe it or not, to your question. And I appreciate the question.
Interesting. You mentioned in 1975, there were virtually no people of color outside of Tuskegee in the veterinary schools.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I mean, there were some, but most of the colleges of veterinary medicine had not accepted one person of color.
Right.
And that's 1975.
That was in 1975. As a matter of fact, I remember I applied to 3 schools. One of them was Tuskegee. And one of the majority schools actually called me. First, they wanted to make sure that I was Black. Phone rang, I answered it, and the person on the other end said, "I'd like to speak to Phil Nelson." And I said, "This is he." And then they said, "Are you a Negro?" And I said, "I happen to be African American, yes." And then they said, "You're trying to get into vet school?" And I said, "Yes." "Well, I have your application here, and I wanted you to know that the application is really good, and I want to make sure you go to vet school, but we're not going to be accepting you. But I want you to know that there's a school for you." And I said, "There's a school for me?" And he said, "Yes, Tuskegee. There's a school for Negroes at Tuskegee." And I said, "Oh, well, I'll check into that," and hung up. But this is one of the universities that had not accepted person of color at that point. And that was 72, 73 when I made my application.
Well, you old men, I was still in high school at that point in time.
Okay, see, you see, Michael, you see what I have to...
You did it. You had to keep putting those numbers out.
Now, obviously things changed because, well, I wouldn't say things changed, but you were dean at the veterinary college at University of Tennessee. Were you the first African-American dean of a veterinary college outside of Tuskegee?
Yes. And I actually thought Dean Nelson would be that person because he was at Mississippi State at the time and things were what they were there. Yes, I was. And I wasn't looking to be a dean. I was chief of staff of the Office of Surgeon General at the time. And these are late 90s. We were heavy into bioterrorism planning. The weapons that we were most concerned about as far as biologic weapons were zoonotic agents. Having traveled about the nation speaking to various audiences, including the deans back then, vet colleges were just missing in action, not focusing on public health. And so I brought that up because when invited to apply, I didn't even respond to it. I eventually agreed to come down and lecture, share my vision, and went back to Washington fully thinking that was just a nice trip and move on with business. But they offered me the job. Took a month to agree, a literal month, because I wasn't looking to be a dean. The reason I took the job was twofold. One was the mission that I just mentioned. We needed these schools to start putting public health back into the curriculum. So I was determined to do my part to stop talking about it once I had the opportunity. The other was personal. I figured that at some point we were going to have a Black dean of a majority school. And I feared that person was going to be trained by them, not Tuskegee. And because of Tuskegee's legacy, Tuskegee deserved the honor of having trained that person. And Phil, I honestly didn't know how your deal was going to work out. I just knew that things weren't always looking very positive for you. And it would have pained me immensely if I had said no, and then lo and behold, some Cornell graduate or whatever would have become that first. That Tuskegee owned that. They needed to own that one.
You just really wanted to prevent Phil from being the first one.
Well, I'm afraid of him, so I wouldn't do that.
I find that perspective quite interesting. The fact that we even have to think that way is dismaying to me.
Yeah.
The fact that that's actual motivation, not your loyalty to your alma mater. That's not the issue. It's how your loyalty to your alma mater has been twisted by the events of society, by the approach society has taken with race, that we have to twist our ethos like a pretzel to become models and mentors, etc. And frankly, had you not been a person of color and you had achieved what you had achieved on a national basis, any institution should have been frolicking over the others to get to you and have you as a dean. And this other issue, which is so important to us, becomes a primary concern.
Well, let me just say there had been probably 3 times I had received letters from search committees. They always went in the trash because
you didn't want to be a dean, because you knew how tough it was to be a dean.
No, I didn't even know what the dean is. I mean, to be honest, no, I was a high-ranking officer in the U.S. Public Health Service. By this time, I had reached the rank of admiral, rear admiral, and projected to, some thought, maybe be the Deputy Surgeon General of the United States. I mean, there was a road still ahead for me. Pardon?
That's my point. That's exactly my point.
So I had to make a sacrifice because I know when you break molds, sometimes things just open up. But having I guess it probably was over a 5-year period, maybe 4-year period where these letters had come in and I had ignored them, I started to get anxious because it was during that time that I thought things were going to happen for you.
I understand.
And yet it was looking not so good.
Right.
And again, I didn't want to have the guilt of Tuskegee not having the honor of having trained the first Black dean. And guys, let's don't miss this. Veterinary medicine got into the 21st century before that kind of change happened. 21st century. How do you do that when the civil rights movement was way back in mid 20th century? You talk about being a little slow on the uptake. So when going back to an earlier question, we say, well, why is we're mostly a white profession? There are reasons that are baked in. There are things like that. For whatever was driving all those schools back in 1975 to not having admitted someone, are they all racist? I don't know. I won't prejudge them, but the evidence suggests maybe they were. And yet we are still sort of falling all over ourselves trying to have the conversation around DEI. You know, one of the first surprises I had as a dean where diversity is concerned, we were undergoing our first accreditation visit on my watch. It was then that I first became familiar with the standards of accreditation. And one of the standards was diversity. Now, this is the year 2001 or 2, roughly. It had to do with diversity of cases, not students, not faculty, not a diverse organization, diversity of cases. And in talking to the Council on Education and others about that, there didn't seem to be much interest. Nobody saw that as much of a problem. 21st century.
And only recently have we put diversity of classes, diversity within the faculty, within the regulations of accreditation. Diversity wasn't a standard. It was a sub-regulation within a standard in the curriculum.
And so it's no mystery why we are a largely white profession. The track record, it's real clear. And now what's happened, we've had so many decades ill-designed for the 21st century that there's a lot of anxiety now around, well, how do we become more diverse? Well, you know, if you started decades ago like everybody else, not everybody, but many others, maybe it wouldn't be so challenging to talk about it and to address it today, but we've got catching up to do. I think we're going to get there too. I'm optimistic, but it's because we're more than half of us are millennials now. I'm waiting for that generation to make their mark because these guys are going to do some wonderful things to improve our society.
I concur.
I concur.
Sorry, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, no, having 2 daughters that are millennials, I fully concur that they will lead the way. The issues that we created in the past, they will somehow find ways to address in the future. But you know, you're talking about 20 years ago as dean of University of Tennessee, and we could have had a whole generation of veterinarians now applying to school in those last 20 years, but we don't. And so we're a generation behind to try to get caught up. That's classic veterinary medicine. Not being proactive, but being reactive.
Not being proactive, because Tennessee, when I arrived, 25 years old, had admitted 4 Black students in a quarter of a century. During less than 8 years as dean, we more than doubled the number of Black students at Tennessee. Now, why was that? It was because I took it upon myself to be proactive and recruit students. Now, it didn't come all easy because I had to bump heads with some faculty and literally remove a faculty member from the admissions committee because I just thought that the person was stuck somewhere in some place that we didn't want in the college. It caused me to look at those admissions decisions, that whole process. So when we talk about a need for systems change, yeah, it includes education. Why is there such a sparse pipeline? And some of the sparseness, veterinary medicine at the college level can't fix because you're too late in the process. I remain hopeful, though. I have to, because I'm not comfortable with the alternative about our society. I don't want to live over there where there's no hope. No, let me just delude myself if that's what I'm doing, but I'm hopeful.
So all of us have lived through this transition, through this change, and there are some bright spots throughout the nation. Where did your father get his training from?
He started at Prairie View undergraduate. Is that what you're asking?
No, where did he get his DVM degree from?
My dad?
Yeah.
Tuskegee.
Okay.
He was in the second class of Tuskegee.
All right. But the original faculty that went to Tuskegee came from schools like Kansas,
Sure did.
College of Veterinary Medicine.
Yep.
As a matter of fact, the founding dean was a Kansas graduate, I believe. And some of the faculty were Cornell grads.
Yes.
So there were some schools that broke the mold, if you will. But still, as far as African-American participation in the veterinary community, it was less than 1% of veterinarians until the mid 80s. And then it increased 100% to 2%.
I know they call that lying with statistics, but go
Yes,
ahead.
I know. Or misleading with
provocative, though. Yeah.
And then in the late 2000s, well, not late, around 2010 or something, we had 4% BIPOC students. We stopped identifying diversity as African American by using the word BIPOC. We still have only 2% of the nation being African American. We still have a problem with that. And as Dr. Blackwell said, that problem is multifactorial. The only thing that has changed has been access, a more openness to recruit BIPOC students. But the preparation of those students, access to quality education has not changed. And we have deeper issues that we have to address. And the profession should look at its own survival in order to motivate itself to educate society as to the needs of a secure, effective primary and secondary educational system, that prepares everybody for the options of being a firefighter or a veterinarian.
Well, you just said the word educate. So we're going back to some of the conversations we've had, but this really goes back to advocacy. It really goes back to advocacy for the veterinary profession, education being a large portion of it. And I think we have not done a good job of self-advocating.
That's true. And this goes back to the concern that Michael raised earlier about how AVMA was his biggest foe in antimicrobial resistance in terms of limiting licensing to veterinarians for antibiotics. But that is a arcane, perverted reflection of capitalism because the veterinary community was being influenced by food producers who wanted access, ease of access to antibiotics.
And the pharmaceutical industry.
And the pharmaceutical industry wanted that same access too, because they sell more.
Yeah.
Right. And yet we failed to take a professional stand on that issue because our clients wanted it for financial reasons. And we chose not to take what was then a controversial view, position. Michael, we're getting close to the end of our allotted time. Peter and I actually force ourselves to quit, and it's like 3 o'clock your time, because we recognize that we could talk the rest of the day if we really wanted to.
Yes.
Well, that's one reason. The other reason is my bladder only has so much space in it. And by now it's time for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But I think this has been fun. We could probably go on for 6 or 7 more hours, which will put us right around Michael's bedtime. Now, I just have one question, and it's going to take probably a minute or two. Dr. Michael Blackwell, if you didn't go to vet school, what would you have done?
It's an excellent question. I think I would have been working with children.
Okay. So you're still working with children. You call them veterinarians, but you're still working with children.
Well, see, I'm not supposed to say that out loud. I mean,
Peter wasn't supposed to either.
one thing I do know is I was literally shaped by a service mindset. So, because my dad repeatedly said veterinary medicine is a service profession, and my mom did things that were service related. So, whatever I was going to be doing, it was going to be that. It would not have been human medicine. I abhor the idea of treating humans. I don't know why. It just gives me the EBGBs. Not because I'm afraid to stick a needle in a human. I've done that. It's just I was shaped by animals who were ill, injured, and watching them struggle to get back on their feet. And just I want to get out in the sunshine. And I always had this image of a human laying up in bed wanting somebody to just take care of them, and they wouldn't do their part. And so the animals had a lot to do with me knowing I wasn't going to treat humans, but probably working with children.
Before Phil wraps it up, I have one more question. We've called these podcasts Courageous Conversations, and I'm sure you've listened to a couple of them. You have an audience. What message would you give to people who are listening to this about the importance of having these types of conversations as a tool for change?
Yes, that's a great and important question. I spent 23 years on active duty, federal government, but our government is not operating effectively, not only at the federal level, but certainly in some state level situations, and maybe even and as well as local. We need community ownership of our future. We need to understand that we are dealing with things out of the 20th century. They were built with good decision making, but they don't work today. And rather than trying to force a square into a round hole, a square peg into a round hole, we need to get behind the younger generation that is trying to make these changes and apply our wisdom. But it's community level ownership. In the case of the profession, we have self-governance, but we are not fulfilling society's needs. The data are clear about that. And it takes proaction to fix that. And we can't do it by ourselves. We need a One Health approach. And I'm optimistic.
We've had the wonderful opportunity of having Dr. Michael Blackwell as our guest today. Peter and I want to thank you, Michael, for taking the time to dive a little deeper into some really important issues. We also want to let you know how much we admire your efforts in broadening access to veterinary care for the general society, and the work that you're doing in trying to improve society through community involvement. Dr. Blackwell was the former dean of Tennessee, was the first dean to hire a social worker in veterinary medicine to handle human issues and to underscore the adnexia that the veterinary profession sits in order to address public health. Michael, thank you so much for attending.
Thank you. I appreciate the conversation. Very stimulating. Fed my soul. Thank you.
We also like to thank our sponsors nationwide for supporting us and having the courage to support the Courageous Conversations.
Michael, hopefully we can have you back again. We'll schedule, 6 or 7 hours so we can get a little deeper into some of the things we talked about today. But
I welcome it. I enjoy these conversations. This is how we get change. We need to talk, dissect, come to understand, the first principle approach to all of this. If you just get rid of all the assumptions, what's at the heart of what we're trying to do, and then go from there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another Courageous Conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.